I have one more box of Band-Aids, and it's for this table over here. I realize we haven't referred very much to what we're doing on this table over here, and it might look like a strange mishmash of shoes and a newspaper and a rock, because it is. But Kent and I had this idea at the outset of this sermon series on the book, An Altar in the World, that for each week that we preached on one of these chapters, we would create in our sanctuary an altar in the world with an object from each chapter that reminds us or represents for us one of the main points of that chapter. And so the rock comes from the very first week where Kent preached about paying attention and waking up to God, and about Jacob who slept with his head on a rock and then all night wrestled with God. And then the mirror comes from the practice of being in the body, looking at ourselves, respecting ourselves fully for the body that houses our unique spirit. The newspaper comes from Kent's sermon on the practice of paying attention, where he talked about his 3-year-old daughter, Lindsay, then 3-year-old daughter, Lindsay. She's now an adult. And when he got home from work and he just wanted 10 minutes and he'd been away all day, he wanted to read the paper, and she kept wanting his attention. And then she finally climbed up in his lap, pulled down the paper, and said, "Daddy, do you see me?" That one makes me cry every time. It's not even my story. The shoes are mine, and it's a little bit of a problem because I put my shoes there, and now for the entire summer I can't wear them. But that comes from the practice of walking barefoot, the practice of being on the earth. The candle with the hands around it is from the practice of encountering others, from the idea that we are all connected and united. That was from our service at Lynch Park, where I talked about how we're all friends on the river. And this week, I'll add these Band-Aids, because this week we're talking about the practice of feeling pain. The practice of feeling pain might be one of the more difficult to wrap our heads around kind of chapters in this entire book. At least it was for me. Some of the others are so uplifting and light. Yes, take off your shoes and just walk barefoot on the earth, and won't it be lovely? But this one is more down in the nitty-gritty, down in the real particulars of what it is to be human. The practice of feeling pain. When I asked Kara to assist me in worship, she said, "Sure, what's the theme for this week?" And I said, "Pain." And she said, "Oh." And I said, "I know it's a little bit of a downer." But it's part of real life. It's part of being human. So let's talk. Let's talk about the practice of feeling pain and what it is to have pain enter into our lives, and what our faith maybe says to us, what our faith suggests to us that we could do that might help us to wrestle with this question of pain in our lives. Now, as I was reading this chapter from this week, Barbara Brown Taylor talks about her fear, her longtime fear of getting blood work done or getting a shot, right? She talks about her fear of needles. And I felt an instant kinship with her because I'm not somebody who does very well with pain in theory. The idea of pain makes me really nervous and really upset. And I really don't like getting blood drawn either. I get really worked up about pain in theory. So thinking ahead to going to the doctor and getting blood drawn makes me really anxious, and I sit down in the chair and the phlebotomist comes over and I put my arm out and then I say, "I'm sorry, I just can't look." And I'm very dramatic, and she says like, "Oh, it's okay," but I'm sure in her head she's like, "Oh, it's fine." But then it's over in 2 minutes and you really don't much feel the needle, and then you walk out and everything's fine. But it's the idea. It's the idea of pain. It's that worry. What's it going to feel like? How much will it hurt? That's the thing I don't do well with. There's another story that I like to tell that really I think is representative of the way that I handle or am apprehensive about pain in theory. It comes from when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school, and I was the vice president of the National Honor Society. And one of the things that the National Honor Society did at Beverly High School was to host a blood drive every year. And so my friend Shannon, who was also an officer, told me that officers were required to give blood. And I had been planning to I was planning to sit there and help, but not give blood because I was so anxious about it and so worked up about it. So Shannon told me officers are required to do this, and if you don't, you have to resign from being an officer. So I walked into the teacher's classroom, our advisor, and very tearfully told her this long story about how I was really scared about giving blood, and so I was very sorry, but I was going to have to resign from being vice president of NHS. And the confused teacher said, I don't know where you got this information. And then in the hallway behind me, I could hear my friend Shannon's cackling laughter, just like rolling off the lockers. But you know, it's that pain in theory that I get worked up about. And maybe some of you are like that too. But the truth is, I don't know if I'm unique in that, because as human beings, I don't think there's too many of us who relish the idea of pain, who look forward to the idea of pain. We know it's something that's going to enter into our lives, but it's something that it's our instinct to want to avoid, to want to protect ourselves from it, to want to protect those that we love from it. That's what our instinct is, but the tough part about being human, the unfortunate part maybe, is that we can't. We can't always protect ourselves from pain. We can't always avoid it. Barbara Brown Taylor writes in this chapter, pain is not optional for humans. Pain is not optional. And that's actually what the Jim Morrison quote at the beginning of your order of worship has to do with as well. Pain is part of the human experience. At some point it will enter into our lives. We don't get to opt out of it as much as we wish we could. I wish I could stand here in this sermon and tell you that I have a way that you can be shielded from pain, that you can protect yourself from the inevitable tragedy, large or small. I wish we could do that, but we can't, because pain is not optional for humans. And so then what do we do? What do we do with that knowledge? What do we do with that information? In this book, Barbara Brown Taylor talks about the way that pain remains a very reliable altar in the world. That's what she calls it, a reliable altar in the world. And I think that has a risk of sounding a little too trite and a little too glossed over and easy, like, oh, welcome your pain because it will help you. But I do think her deeper point is we know pain enters our lives. And so when we're in those places, what's our encounter with the divine like? Where is God in those moments? What does our faith tell us about those moments? How might it help us through? How do we make sense of what it is to be human and know that we have these moments of rich joy and celebration and also these moments of deep, searing pain? Well, I think there are a few things that our faith can offer us. I think our faith tells us that we need to give ourselves permission to feel, really feel our pain when we're in it. And then I think that our faith tells us that we can and should and will heal from our pain. And then I think our faith tells us that we can work through and eventually move past our pain. So we need to feel our pain, heal from our pain, and move through our pain. Those are the 3 steps, but let's look a little bit more closely at where I'm finding those steps. In the scripture that we heard this morning, one from Job and one from Jeremiah, there is no question that the speakers were feeling deep pain. They were in it, really in it. Probably each one of us can conjure up a moment in our own lives where we felt that. Each moment might be different. What prompted it is going to be different, and yet the pain with which Job and Jeremiah are calling out, that's familiar to us. We understand that. We've felt it. We've sat with it. There's no question that Job is a good person. The Bible tells us he was upright, he was honest, he was a good person, and yet he was beset by misery and tragedy, and he's just in it and crying out to God with those big universal questions. Why is this happening? Why is there suffering? Why am I suffering? We know those questions. We've been in those places. And Jeremiah is a prophet who's been trying to convince his people to turn away from their depravity, from their bad political practices, from their corruption, so that they might resist being overthrown by a Babylonian empire. And he hasn't been successful. They have not changed their ways. And so in this part, that was interesting. In this part that we heard this morning, they've been overthrown by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians were not a particularly nice people. So once they overthrew your empire, they weren't particularly kind. And Jeremiah speaks very poignantly in this passage about the grief he feels. You know, he'd been telling the people to change their ways. They haven't. He could have just said, you know, guys, I told you so. But that's not the Jeremiah we see here. He says, my heart is sick with grief. My heart is sick with grief. And then he says, if only my head were waters and my eyes were fountains of tears. That's how much grief I feel. Just fountains of tears to weep for my people. Job and Jeremiah, they're deep in the pain. They're feeling it. And so I think when we're in those moments, we cannot hope to move forward without also giving ourselves permission to feel it. I wish there were a way to do it without having to feel that pain. I wish there were. A way that we could just sort of brush through it and not feel deep sorrow or deep hurt. And yet, God has gifted us not only with free will, but with access as human beings to an incredible breadth and depth of human experience, a wide spectrum of what we experience and what we feel, and pain is on that spectrum. And if we could not feel pain, then neither could we feel and experience and recognize incredible joy. It's this really complex duality of being human, that in order to recognize our greatest moments, our most joyful moments, our most celebratory moments, as Kara talked about, that duality of concerns and celebrations, in order to feel those greatest joys, those most fulfilling highs, we have to be on that spectrum. We have to have in place all of those different emotions. And pain is one of them. If we did not and could not recognize and feel pain, then we could not and would not recognize and feel joy. What a complex reality we exist in. And so when we're in those moments, like Jeremiah, like Job, we need to give ourselves time and permission to feel it, to feel that pain. And then what I think our faith tells us is that there is healing that will come. When we're in pain, we feel it, and then we begin to move ahead. We begin to move towards healing. Our own bodies, our own physical bodies give us evidence that healing is possible. And not only that it's possible, that healing can bring us some of our greatest strength. Because our own physical bodies are held up and supported by our bones, our skeleton. And we know that our bones are not indestructible. Anybody here ever broken a bone? Yeah, Pam has a broken bone right now. That was a really mean question. I'm sorry. Pam has a broken bone. So we know our bones are not indestructible. And yet, one of the most amazing things, or what I think is one of the most interesting things about the human body, is that it is a fact that when our bones knit back together, the place where they come back together and heal becomes stronger than any other spot that is yet untested, that has not been broken. What a fascinating metaphor for the way that pain works perhaps in our own lives. We feel pain, we heal from it. And some of the things that may have felt like our greatest weaknesses, our most vulnerable and tender spots, can also become a source of some of our greatest strength. When we've experienced and moved through pain, we begin to grow in all kinds of ways. Perhaps we're more compassionate. Perhaps we're more empathetic. Maybe we seek and grant forgiveness more readily. Maybe we reach out our hand more quickly to somebody else in a similar situation. We understand what it is to feel broken and tested and tried. And we see that in other people, and our own strength has grown from the places that we felt the most vulnerable and the most broken. We feel our pain, and we heal from our pain. We are bodies that can get hurt, both emotionally and physically. And yet, we are not bodies that are made only for pain. We are bodies that are made for healing. We're bodies that are made for healing. God has infused us flesh and bone, with heart and soul and spirit. God's presence is in us and around us, and we are made for healing. The folk singer and songwriter Ani DiFranco has a song where she talks about sort of this process and says, we're made to bleed and scab and heal and bleed again, but we turn every scar into a joke. Maybe not a joke, but maybe what she's talking about is that we know that we go through this process and there is hope. There is hope for us to move forward and to find strength in those most broken places. In the 80s movie Beaches, which is a little dated now, but stay with me, which some of you know this, but I will confess, I liked it so much in college that I may have accidentally on purpose kept it forever from Blockbuster. Don't worry, they billed my dad, who paid way more than I would have just paid if I'd gone and bought the movie. So I still have it on VHS in a Blockbuster box, which is a little piece of history now, because where can you watch it? Anyway, the movie Beaches, stay with me. The movie Beaches is a great example of the ways that we can move through and heal from pain, but it also illustrates for us one of the risks that I think there is with pain. And that is that in the movie, Barbara Hershey's character, whose name is Hillary, is diagnosed with a very serious virus that attacks the muscle of her heart. It's a virus for which there is no cure. And so her best friend, Cece, who's played by Bette Midler, goes and picks Hillary up and takes Hillary and her little daughter Victoria to the beach for the summer so that they can have that time together, so that Hillary and Victoria can be in that place together instead of her mother always being in the hospital at the end of her life. And they go to the beach, but Hillary is unwilling or unable to really interact with Cece or with her daughter. She puts up a wall, she can't really be in conversation with them, doesn't want them to come near her. She sits in a chair alone day after day. Until finally, Cece confronts her best friend about this and about the division she's creating and the distance she's keeping from both of them, but primarily from her daughter. And Hillary says, "You just don't get it, do you? All I want, can't you see that all I want is to be left alone? To be left alone. All I want is to be left alone." And that is the danger. That's the risk of being human. When we're in those places of pain, when we're feeling it, and we're really feeling it, the danger is shutting ourselves off from other people. Now, in the movie, of course, because it's a movie, Cece is able to get through to her friend and prevails, and so Hillary is able to spend time with her daughter, which turns out to be priceless for her daughter, as you might imagine. But I think it's also illustrative for us of what can happen when we're really in that pain. This funny switch can happen, and we need to be aware of that and careful of that when we're feeling these moments, when we're trying to heal, that sometimes the very thing that we most feared, the very thing we most wanted to avoid, the very thing we most hoped to insulate ourselves and our loved ones from, that pain becomes so comfortable, becomes such a part of our story and part of who we are that we begin to hold tight to it. We may not have welcomed it, we may not have wanted it, but once it settles in with us, we understand it, right? We know its edges, we know its parameters, we know how it feels. It's sort of like a sweater that's been around for a long time. Maybe it's starting not to look very good, but you understand it. You know how it fits and feels on you, and pain can be like that. It's this funny flip that happens. We don't welcome it, we don't want it, but sometimes if we can't let others in, if we can't let our God in, if we can't let hope in, we sometimes get into this little walled off place like Hillary in the movie, where we cling to the pain because it's the most familiar thing we know. And I think that for that, to be reminded that God is always with us and that God's incredible gift of peace and wholeness is always right there. God doesn't abandon us in moments of pain. God is in that pain with us. And God keeps trying to show up in the presence of other people all around us. And so we feel our pain, we work to heal from our pain, and then we need to work to put it in its proper place in our hearts. to open the doors of our lives again and let others back in. Let them support us. Let them be with us. Let our pain go so that we might, as Barbara Brown Taylor talks about, break through. And in Job, that's the second piece of that scripture that we heard. It talks about there being hope. You will have hope, and you will be able to move forward. You'll be able to move forward. Now, God's shalom, God's peace, God's wholeness is a concept that's mentioned over and over again in the Bible, and I think it's what's gifted to each of us in these situations too. But the thing about shalom that is so interesting is that although we sometimes translate it as peace, it doesn't mean the absence of trouble alone. It's a much more complex and sophisticated concept. It means everything that makes up our highest and our greatest good. Wholeness, healing, everything that God hopes for us as full people. And that gift is available to us. So we feel our pain, we work to heal from it, and then we begin to find a proper place in our hearts for it so that we might move through it and embrace this gift of shalom. There's a few examples in the Bible that I think really show us this, but perhaps the best one comes from the disciples. Those who followed Jesus, his best friends, those who loved him deeply, and those who experienced his loss. Experienced the deep and devastating loss at his brutal death on the cross. The disciples could have turned inward. They could have turned inward and just been in that pain, which they surely felt. Those of us who read the story with thousands of years of perspective know that what was to follow, not only for Jesus but for the disciples, was new life, new beginning, new journeys. But they couldn't have known that. And so they were in that place of pain, and yet they found a way to open wide the doors of the house and to open wide the doors of their hearts to begin to move through it. It would have been hard for them to preach a gospel of good news to the world if they had remained huddled and turned inward. And the same is true for us. What if in 1975, after this church burned to the ground, what if instead of rallying together, instead of being invigorated and moving through the pain of that deep loss, what if this congregation, instead of moving forward, had just huddled inward, sort of shut down, closed in on itself? It would be hard to preach a gospel of good news or to do good work in the world if that had happened. Or what if, after the difficult conversations and profoundly prophetic decision in the late 1990s that this church made to become welcoming and affirming, to welcome all people, to hire a gay minister, what if after that, instead of being able to heal relationships and move forward, the church had remained divided and hurt, huddled in on itself? Or what if after Craig Collimer's retirement in 2011, when the search for a new minister was dragging on and on and on, instead of keeping at it faithfully and prayerfully, what if the search committee had thrown up its hands and said that there's just nobody out there? We just can't do this. Instead, they continued searching faithfully and ultimately found a minister, Kent. Who could imagine now not having him here with us? But what if instead of continuing that journey, they had turned in on themselves? What if the church had turned in on itself? When we are in places of pain, we feel it, we heal from it, and then we have to find a place for it in our hearts and move through it. That's true of institutions, and it's true of each one of us. Now, all of that is not to say that in any way I would like to minimize the very real pain and suffering that we feel. It's there. And don't try to erase painful memories completely from your story. What we've experienced, the ups, the downs, the losses, the joys, all of those things together, those things make each of us who we are. So honor that. But find a place in our hearts and move toward that hope that we know is always out there. Rely on other people on the journey. Take a hand when you need it. Offer a hand when someone else needs it. But continue moving forward. So today, as you go out into the world, as you go out into the next days of your week, your year, there is no question that there will be high moments, and there is no question that there will be pain. And I'm sorry. I wish the end of this sermon was to say that you all go forth and I have put some kind of insulation around you lucky few and around me, and we don't feel it. But we will. We know we will. So know in those moments that there is permission, that you should, that you must, that our faith tells us, that our God calls us to feel it. And God will be with you in it, feeling it too. And then heal from it. And begin to move forward. Trust that the places that feel the most broken will become perhaps the source of greatest strength. Don't put up the walls. Open yourself to new life, new beginnings, and an ever-changing journey, as the gift of God's incredible shalom is all around you. You, God's beloved sons and daughters, you are never alone on your journey, not in your joyful moments, and most certainly not in the painful ones. Amen.